Today we're going to talk about composition. Composition is the key to all photography. It's also the key to paintings, drawings, and other forms of artwork. Composition talks about where to put the subject and how to photograph or document a scene using only your viewfinder, which is a height and width uh, setup. So you have this little box you have to kind of put everything into the frame, and that's composition. Composition has 7 key ways to think about. You can use any of these in any combination. You can use only one, or you can use multiple. The idea for a good photographer to advance themselves is to use multiple compositions at one time, and that can be done in different ways. Rule of thirds is the first and primary compositional rule that you'll have. Painters use it, people who draw use it, illustrators. If you're creating a scene, you basically would want to divide the viewfinder into thirds, and depending on how you use those divisions is how you make a composition. Now, normally we are attuned to basically centering the subject into the center of a composition, such as this picnic bench. Partly that's because the fact that that's where the focusing dot is. From cameras from the 1950s and onwards, they always put the focusing uh, dot in the middle, or how you compose a picture, so everybody just makes it perfectly focused. But that's kind of a downside because of the fact that everybody's going to be, if you're photographing people or things, you just kind of put it in the center, and there's nothing dynamic about it. But ultimately, you can actually just imagine taking your 2 lines, both on the horizontal and the vertical axis, and put them into a grid format. Now, there's 2 ways to use the rule of thirds. One way to use the rule of third is to put the subject at the intersection of a grid line, like this one here. This is the grid line for the upper left. Here's the one for the upper right, the lower right, and the lower left. Now, that's the primary way to use it, is to put it on the intersection. The other way that you can use it is to go off the intersections, like here, and push it a little bit further to the side. Or in this case with the man on the horse, push it really, not on the intersection. You can see the tree here is not completely directly on the intersection, so it gives you a little bit more space on the left side. And you can see the house or the shed here is pretty much right on the intersection. Now, there's also what's called the direct approach. A lot of times we walk around with a point of view, and our general point of view is from where we stand and from where we sit, and that, which is good. It's a great point of view. I love that point of view. But the direct approach is really being more purposeful in your composition. For instance, for portraiture, portraits, if you look at the portraits of these 2 folks here, they are directly in front of you. They feel like they're right there, and they could be, in some sense, they're not angled, and they're just face to face with you, even though the height of the person may be greatly taller or shorter than you. But it seems like they're just right there. Direct approach also works its way into food photography. Oftentimes, like the image on the right, it is a direct approach, but it's also the common view that we see when we're sitting at a table. But a lot of times, if you look at Instagram or a lot of food magazines or food websites, there's a lot of photography where it's very direct and it's very straight on to the subject. One thing to always consider as part of your composition is the background. The background is very important to the subject because it helps keep a separation between the two, even though they're as you see it, it's all together. For instance, the photograph on the left with this dark riverbank on the other side kind of leads into this person's head, and there's no separation. And one thing that helps in photography is contrast. So, for instance, this dark-skinned man looks is more pronounced and more prominent when the photographer lowered themselves a little bit to the ground and was shooting up, and so this person's head was against the white clouds or the gray clouds of the sky. This gives you a lot of important separation between the subject and the background. Another case and example is that when I'm out photographing, I tend to like to avoid any pictures with power lines in them, the electrical utility lines. So I will always, because for me, looking at a landscape photograph, it's really disturbing to see like the power lines because it takes away from the natural beauty. So whenever I'm photographing, I always tend to look at the background and to make sure it's not so distracting for my subjects. And I will make an adjustment or move myself so that background becomes clearer or less noticeable. Another way to think about this background is that if it's busy, such as the one on the left here, is that white parts of a background are more noticeable than the dark parts of a background. Our eyes has a tendency to gravitate to the brightest part of any painting or photograph or drawing. And that, in many ways, in photography can be distracting in this case. It's also very cluttered and very busy back here. And then the photographer re-photographed this person using a different background, a lot more subdued and less distracting background, so your concentration is mostly on the person's face here. Another thing about background is what we call shallow depth of field. And shallow depth of field is a process of using your lens to basically blur out the background. A camera only has one point of focus. And maybe in 20 years we'll have the camera that can focus everything from foreground to background. But for today, cameras can only focus on one thing at a time. So for instance, with this bird, there's relatively both of these shots are fairly the same shot. One maybe on the one on the right is a little more zoomed in, but otherwise it's really the same shot. What the photographer did through using the f-stop or the aperture is control the depth of field. This is something we might be talking about a little bit later. And with that control, you can actually, if you're using a shallow depth of field, you kind of make the background look like it's blurrier. It's just not in focus, or it doesn't appear to be in focus. But it also gives the background less attention. For instance, if you see this right here, this is just a little branch, which is this same branch right here that's kind of broken off. It's less noticeable when you have a shallow depth of field, but it's also, so make sure that the attention focuses on the bird itself. You can do shallow depth of field in your handheld devices. It's just a little trickier because your camera does all the work for you. Negative space. Now, negative space is not a bad thing. Negative space is actually a really good thing, despite the use of the word negative. Negative space really talks about the background. In traditional painting or photography or drawings or paintings, we always talk about the subject foreground, or positive background. So in this case, if we think about the positive space is what the subject that we recognize. So this would be the human being right here, or the lighthouse. This space right around in here is called negative space. It is basically the background to the subject. But negative space can also be the foreground, such as in this case here, where it looks like a set of stairs. This is the foreground, the orange part, and then the red is the background. But negative space is very valuable in a lot of ways because it really helps solidify what the subject is without any confusion. It's also a consideration of the background. But also what's most important is that it really kind of makes the photograph not evenly balanced. It kind of weights it a little bit, so you can see that the weight of the photograph is for the subject is more to the right side, and then the weight of the subject for the person is a little bit more to the left side. But what negative space also does is gives graphic designers a space to work in text. So if you look at advertising a lot, you'll see a lot of advertising where it's like, the object or subject right over here, and then they put on this text, buy this product now. This could be like, go visit a lighthouse. And it can be in really big letters, so it has this visual interest between left side and right side. Negative space doesn't have to be left or right. It can also be top too. Again, this is practicing the rule of thirds. You can see the subject here is pushed down to the lower third of the image, just like the giraffe here is pushed, and the landscape and the tree is pushed down to the lower third. But it gives you this large amount of negative space to be able to kind of get a sense of the vastness of the image. This one here on the right, this person smoking a cigarette. It's hard to see on this screen, but you can see like the wafts of smoke, just kind of floating up into the negative space. Now, movement. Movement is one of the hardest things to capture in photography, but it's also a compositional element. It also kind of gives you the idea of like, the action that's going on, and it's not necessarily stationary or somebody's just sitting there. So, for instance, in this case, there's two sense of movement in between these two pictures. Image on the left is basically the camera in position and not moving at all, and everything moves in front of the camera. Okay, that's why you see the background. You can recognize the background. You can see that looks like a house. There's some plants back there. It's all in crisp detail because the camera's not moving. But it shows that the subject, you can clearly see that the subject is moving in front of the camera. Now, the image on the right is a sense of movement. This is a photography technique that a lot of sports photographers, action photographers will use when they're documenting fast-moving subjects. So, for instance, this bicycle is coming down the trail, and the photographer is basically following the camera with the bicycle as it's coming into view. And as the photographer decides to make the image right about this point, and is still moving the camera with the bicyclist. So that way, the bicyclist appears to be sharp and in focus, but the background appears to be moving. So it's almost like capturing the subject in midair and being able to see, like, this is what they would see, the bicyclist would see, was the movement around them. And this is just a simple thing of just like lining your camera up with something that's moving and just tracing it and tracking it until you get to the point where you want to take the picture, and then keep the camera moving with the subject. Movement can also be demonstrated like in a vehicle, in a sense. We know cars are moving, but if you're in the car, or if you have a camera mounted to a car, and you slow down the shutter speed a little bit, you can actually see that the road is moving, but the car is not, because the camera and the car are traveling at the same rate of speed, so there's no sense of seeing that movement. But you see what the outside world is, you can see that it's moving. So like, for instance, the one on the right, it's the best example I can say. It's the shutter speed is slow, so the longer the shutter speed is open, the blurrier things get that are moving. But again, the camera and the car are moving at the same rate of speed, so you don't notice that the car is out of focus or blurry. Another technique which is very popular is called framing. Framing, the way I like to describe it, is that you're looking through something, or you're using something between you and the subject to obscure or hide parts of the picture that's in the background. For instance, the picture on the left, natural rock formations like this offer a really wonderful use of framing. And then the photographer basically moved his body into a position to where this rock formation is kind of like encircled by the rock formation in the foreground. And then it also, to add to this, like, this mountain range back here is also within the frame of this rock. Another popular way to look at framing is to look through doorways, windows, because they offer this kind of foreground, which you see here, and then a peek at the background, which can also add a little bit of mystery or hide some things. Um, Again, bridges, windows, anything that you can look through. You can see that here's the foreground of this tunnel, and then here's the frame here of this couple coming through the tunnel. And it kind of helps you kind of focus and direct your attention to where to go in the image. And again, here's rule of thirds. Not much negative space because this has a lot of texture in it, but it's quantifiable, but it's just not a lot. But then the picture on the right, you can see here, this is shot through from behind the subject here. The subject is holding the mirror, which now you can see the front of the subject, even though you're looking from the behind the subject. This part is in focus. This has the shallow depth of field over here, which creates a tremendous amount of negative space. It's still a little busy, but it's still a little bit of negative space. And then you can see that everything's focused here, and the circular part of the mirror only captures what is in the viewfinder, or what's in the view of the mirror. Another one is called point of view. Now, earlier we talked about direct approach, is getting straight up onto something, not looking at it, not looking at an angle, just kind of like get right into it. But the point of view is also very popular because we all have a point of view. It's from where we stand or where we sit. Again, that's pretty much our everyday modality of how we see things. But for a photographer, photographers don't want you to show you their point of view. They want to show you a different way to look at things. So in this case here on the left, this young person is laying in the grass, and the photographer got themselves low to the ground, so it kind of looks like the same. They're direct, but it's changing the point of view to where they're with the person instead of like just standing up and looking down at them. But when you're looking down like this on the picture on the right, it's not generally a normal point of view you would see, that being almost right on top of this person's head and looking down at this person's veil. Again, there's that shallow depth of field in both of these images, so you don't see much of the background. You can see it's like the point of focus for there is right about here, and then just drops off into the back. Again, point of view works its way into food photography and becomes that direct approach. So you can see where like some of these, definitions are coming in and working with each other in different ways. This is again, changing your point of view. You would generally not see a cake directly from above unless you're standing right above it. Usually you see it at a slight angle. And then on this one here on the right, you can see that there's a different perspective. You're kind of looking up at everybody. This photographer has changed her position. They're a little bit lower and then looking up. And, the gesture of this person here, the hand is showing what's going to go down with where they came from, but then the angle is showing like how much more they have to climb. So you can kind of get different perspectives when you change that point of view. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or feel free to email me with any questions you might have, and we can discuss it. Or you come in during the open Zoom times, and we can talk about these compositions.